"You'll never amount to anything, Cassandra. Stop dreaming." That's what my mother, Ruth Kelloway, told me when I announced I was applying to law school. She said it again when I graduated summa cum laude. And again when I passed the bar exam on my first try. But she went silent. Completely, utterly silent. The day her boss at Meridian Financial Services had to stand up in my courtroom and address me as Your Honor. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Cassandra Rivers, and from wherever you're watching this, stay with me. Have you ever been so thoroughly dismissed by your own family that when you finally succeeded beyond their wildest imagination, they couldn't even process what they were seeing? Let me take you back to where it all started, in the cramped duplex on Elmwood Avenue in Riverside, where my mother worked double shifts to keep us afloat after my father left when I was 12. Ruth had dreams once. She'd wanted to be a teacher, but life had other plans. By the time I was in high school, she'd been working as a senior administrative coordinator at Meridian Financial for 8 years, filing paperwork, managing schedules, and taking orders from people she called the suits upstairs. And somehow, in her mind, my ambitions were just as unrealistic as hers had been. Law school? She'd scoff, folding laundry in our tiny living room. Do you know how much that costs? Do you see lawyers growing up in places like this? She'd gesture around our modest home with its peeling wallpaper and secondhand furniture. You need to be practical, Cassie. Get a decent job with benefits. Maybe work your way up at a company like Meridian. They have good insurance. But I wasn't practical. I was stubborn. While my mother dreamed small and safe, I dreamed impossible. I worked 3 part-time jobs through college: tutoring at Riverside Community College, waitressing at Denny's on weekend nights, and cleaning offices downtown before dawn. Every dollar I saved went toward my LSAT prep books and application fees. "This is foolish," Ruth would say, watching me study at our kitchen table until 2 a.m. "You're setting yourself up for disappointment. Our kind of people don't become lawyers. We work for lawyers." Our kind of people. That phrase haunted me. She'd say it every time I mentioned my plans, as if we were trapped in some predetermined class that I was foolish to think I could escape. When I got my acceptance letter to Grandview University School of Law, I ran home with the news, practically floating. I found her in the kitchen, still in her Meridian uniform, navy blazer, sensible shoes, name tag that read Ruth K. "Mom, I got in, full scholarship." She looked at the letter for exactly 3 seconds before handing it back. "Scholarships can be revoked, Cassandra. And then what? You'll be drowning in debt with no backup plan." She turned back to washing dishes. "I called my supervisor today. Mr. Hendricks said they might have an opening in accounting. It's steady work. Steady work. Safe work. Small work." I moved to Grandview that fall with 2 suitcases and a determination that burned hotter every time my mother voiced her doubts. She didn't come to my graduation. "Too expensive to take time off," she said. She didn't celebrate when I landed my first position as a public defender. "Those jobs don't pay well," was her only comment. 3 years later, when I was appointed as an associate judge for the Northern District Court of Grandview County at age 31, the youngest person ever to hold the position, she had exactly one thing to say: "Well, I hope you don't let it go to your head." I'd stopped expecting her support by then. I'd stopped calling to share my victories. I'd learned to celebrate myself, to be proud of my own accomplishments without needing her validation. Because the woman who told me I'd never amount to anything had never learned to dream beyond the walls of her own limitations. But life has a way of creating moments that force people to confront the stories they've told themselves. Moments where the practical daughter they dismissed becomes the authority figure they must face. Moments where all their careful predictions crumble in a single devastating instant. Last Tuesday was one of those moments. It started like any other morning in courtroom 7B of the Grandview County Courthouse. I had a docket full of cases: contract disputes, small business litigation, the usual civil matters that fill a Tuesday morning session. I was reviewing my notes when my clerk handed me the day's case files, and there it was: Meridian Financial Services versus Hartwell Construction Group. I recognized the company name immediately, of course. How could I not? My mother had worked there for over 15 years now. She'd been promoted twice and currently held the title of Senior Operations Coordinator. But in my 4 years on the bench, our professional worlds had never intersected. Until that Tuesday. The hearing was scheduled for 10:30 a.m. Standard corporate litigation. Meridian was pursuing payment for consulting services that Hartwell claimed were substandard. Nothing unusual, nothing particularly complicated. I expected to see the typical parade of lawyers in expensive suits representing both sides. What I didn't expect was to see my mother walk through those courtroom doors. She entered behind Meridian's legal team, carrying a thick file folder and wearing her most professional outfit, the same navy blazer she'd worn to every company function for the past 5 years. Her hair was pulled back in the tight bun she always wore to work, and she had that focused, slightly nervous expression she got when she knew important people were watching. My mother, Ruth Kelloway, was there as a key witness for Meridian. She'd been the one managing the project documentation, the contract details, the paper trail that would make or break their case. She took a seat in the front row, just behind the plaintiff's table, and began organizing her papers with the methodical precision that had made her so valuable to her employers. She was in her element. Competent, professional, prepared, and she had absolutely no idea that the judge presiding over her company's case was the daughter she'd spent 20 years telling would never amount to anything. I sat there behind the bench, looking down at the woman who had shaped my entire life through her doubts, watching her prepare to participate in a legal proceeding in my courtroom. The irony was so perfect it felt scripted. In less than an hour, Ruth Kelloway, the woman who told me our kind of people don't become lawyers, we work for lawyers, was going to stand up in my courtroom and address me as Your Honor. And she still had no idea what was coming. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I sat frozen behind the bench, my black robes suddenly feeling heavier than they ever had before. The irony of the moment wasn't lost on me. After 4 years of presiding over cases, of commanding respect in this very courtroom, the one person who had never believed in my abilities was sitting 15 feet away, completely oblivious to who would be deciding her company's fate. Ruth continued shuffling through her papers, occasionally leaning forward to whisper something to Meridian's lead attorney, a sharp-dressed woman named Patricia Vance, who clearly valued my mother's organizational skills. Mom had that look of intense concentration she always got when she knew she was being depended upon, the same expression she'd worn during parent-teacher conferences when I was young, before she'd given up on my potential entirely. The bailiff, Officer Rodriguez, called the court to order. All rise for the Honorable Judge Cassandra Rivers. I watched my mother stand with everyone else, her eyes focused straight ahead toward the bench where I sat. But she wasn't really looking at me. Not yet. She was looking at the position, the title, the authority. In her mind, she was probably thinking about what she always thought when she encountered judges. These are the people Cassie thought she could become. These are the people our kind of people work for, not with. Please be seated, I said, my voice carrying the authority I'd cultivated over years of practice. The room settled, and I could see my mother taking out a pen, preparing to take notes like the diligent employee she'd always been. Meridian's attorneys stood to present their opening statement. Your Honor, Meridian Financial Services entered into a consulting agreement with Hartwell Construction Group to provide comprehensive project management oversight for their expansion into the Westfield Commercial District. Despite fulfilling all contractual obligations, Hartwell has refused payment, citing alleged deficiencies that our evidence will prove are without merit. I nodded, making notes, playing my role perfectly. My mother was writing everything down, probably preparing a report for her supervisors about how the case was proceeding. She'd always been thorough like that. It's what had kept her employed for over 15 years, what had earned her those 2 promotions she was so proud of. "Ms. Vance," I said, "I see you have several witnesses listed. Will you be calling them in any particular order?" "Yes, Your Honor. We'll begin with Mrs. Ruth Kelloway, our Senior Operations Coordinator, who managed all documentation related to this project." My heart hammered against my ribs. This was really happening. In a matter of minutes, my mother was going to walk to that witness stand, swear to tell the truth, and then spend the next hour answering questions while looking directly at me. The daughter she told would never succeed sitting in judgment over her testimony. "Very well. Please call your first witness." The plaintiff calls Ruth Kelloway to the stand. My mother stood gracefully, smoothing down her blazer in that nervous gesture I remembered from childhood. She walked toward the witness stand with purpose, her sensible heels clicking against the marble floor of the courtroom. She was professional, composed, ready to do her job well, just like she always did. But as she approached the witness stand, something made her glance up at the bench. Really look at it for the first time since entering the courtroom. Our eyes met. I watched the recognition dawn slowly across her face. First confusion, a furrowing of her brow as if she was trying to place a familiar face. Then disbelief, her eyes widening slightly as her brain processed what she was seeing. Then shock, her mouth opening just a fraction before she caught herself and closed it again. For a moment, time stood completely still in courtroom 7B. Ruth Kelloway, Senior Operations Coordinator at Meridian Financial Services, the woman who had spent 20 years telling me I'd never amount to anything, was staring directly into the face of her daughter, the Honorable Judge Cassandra Rivers. I could see her mind racing, trying to process the impossibility of what she was experiencing. The daughter she'd dismissed, the girl she'd told to be practical, the young woman whose law school dreams she'd called foolish. That person was now sitting behind the bench wearing the black robes of judicial authority, about to preside over her testimony. "Mrs. Kelloway," the bailiff prompted gently, "please approach the witness stand." My mother blinked, shook her head slightly as if clearing it, and continued walking. But I could see the tremor in her hands now, the way her confident stride had become more hesitant. She reached the witness stand and placed her left hand on the Bible, raising her right hand as Officer Rodriguez administered the oath. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" "I do," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please state your name for the record," I said, my voice steady and professional, despite the surreal nature of the moment. She looked directly at me, and I could see years of assumptions crumbling behind her eyes. Ruth Elizabeth Kelloway." "And your occupation, Mrs. Kelloway?" "I'm a Senior Operations Coordinator at Meridian Financial Services." Her voice was growing stronger, but I could see the questions swirling in her mind. How long had I been a judge? How had this happened? How had the daughter she'd written off as impractical and unrealistic ended up in a position where she could determine the outcome of her employer's lawsuit? Ms. Vance approached the witness stand, apparently oblivious to the family drama unfolding in her case. "Mrs. Kelloway, how long have you been employed by Meridian Financial?" 15 years and 4 months, my mother answered automatically, though her eyes kept drifting back to me. "And what were your responsibilities regarding the Hartwell construction project?" As my mother began to explain her role in managing the project documentation, I realized something profound was happening. For the first time in our entire relationship, Ruth Kelloway was being forced to address me with the respect and deference that my position commanded. Every question I asked, every ruling I made, every procedural decision, she had to accept it all. The woman who had never believed I could succeed was now sitting in my courtroom, under oath, participating in a legal proceeding that I controlled completely. And the most beautiful part? She had no choice but to call me Your Honor. As my mother settled into the witness stand, I took a moment to observe the courtroom dynamics that were about to shift dramatically. Courtroom 7B was my domain, a space where I'd established my authority through 4 years of consistent, fair rulings. The high ceilings and dark wood paneling created an atmosphere of gravity and tradition. Behind the plaintiff's table, 3 Meridian executives sat in their expensive suits, confident that their star witness would help them secure a favorable judgment. There was David Hendricks, Vice President of Operations, the same man who had once offered me that steady accounting job through my mother. He sat with his arms crossed, occasionally checking his Rolex, clearly viewing this as a routine matter that would be resolved in Meridian's favor. Beside him sat Jennifer Walsh, the company's chief financial officer, scrolling through emails on her phone with the casual indifference of someone accustomed to winning corporate disputes. The third executive was someone I didn't recognize, a younger man in a charcoal gray suit who kept glancing nervously between my mother and the defense table. Later, I would learn this was Thomas Brennan, the project manager whose oversight had allegedly caused the contract dispute. For now, he was just another face in the constellation of Meridian power players who had gathered to watch my mother perform her role as their key witness. On the defense side, Hartwell Construction's legal team looked significantly less polished. Their lead attorney, Michael Santos, was competent but clearly operating with a smaller budget than Meridian's corporate lawyers. His client, Robert Hartwell, sat hunched over a stack of invoices and project reports, the kind of hands-on contractor who probably built his business from nothing and wasn't accustomed to corporate litigation. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Meridian's team exuded the confidence of institutional power, while Hartwell's side had the scrappy determination of underdogs fighting for survival. It was a dynamic I'd seen countless times in my courtroom, but today it carried extra weight because my mother was sitting squarely in the camp of institutional authority. Ruth had always been proud of her association with Meridian's success. She'd frame her company newsletters, attend every holiday party, and speak reverently about the executives upstairs, as if they were royalty. When she received her 15-year service pin, she displayed it prominently on our refrigerator next to her employee parking pass and her photo from the company picnic. Working for a company like Meridian teaches you professionalism, she'd often say. These people know how to succeed. They understand how the real world works. It was always an implicit criticism of my choices, as if my pursuit of law school was evidence that I didn't understand how the real world works. Now, watching her fidget with her papers while trying not to look directly at me, I realized she was about to discover exactly how the real world worked when her daughter controlled the courtroom. Ms. Vance continued her examination, walking my mother through the timeline of the Hartwell project. Mrs. Kelloway, can you tell the court when Meridian first entered into discussions with Hartwell Construction? According to our records, initial contact was made on March 15th of last year, Ruth replied, consulting her meticulously organized files. Mr. Brennan reached out to them regarding their proposed expansion into the Westfield Commercial District. I watched my mother transform into her professional persona, the competent, detail-oriented employee who had earned the respect of her supervisors through years of reliable service. This was Ruth at her best, in her element, demonstrating the organizational skills that had kept her employed and promoted within Meridian's corporate structure. "And what was your role in managing this relationship?" Ms. Vance asked. "I was responsible for maintaining all project documentation, coordinating communications between our consulting team and Hartwell's management, and ensuring that all deliverables were properly documented and filed according to our company protocols." The executives behind the plaintiff's table nodded approvingly. This was exactly the kind of testimony they needed. Clear, factual, backed by documentation. My mother had always excelled at this type of work, and I found myself feeling a grudging respect for her professional competence, even as I maintained my judicial neutrality. But there was something else happening in the courtroom that the lawyers and executives couldn't see. Every few minutes, my mother's eyes would drift toward the bench, toward me, and I could see her struggling to reconcile the daughter she thought she knew with the authority figure presiding over the proceedings. During her testimony about contract modifications, she stumbled slightly over a date, catching herself and consulting her notes before continuing. "I'm sorry, Your Honor, let me double-check that timeline." The words "Your Honor" came out strained, as if she was still testing whether they could possibly be addressed to me. Ms. Vance guided her through exhibit after exhibit: emails, project reports, billing statements, compliance documentation. My mother handled each one with professional precision, explaining the chain of custody, the approval process, the quality control measures that Meridian had implemented throughout the project. "Mrs. Kelloway," Ms. Vance said, holding up a thick folder, "I'm showing you what's been marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit 12. Can you identify this document?" Ruth accepted the folder and examined its contents carefully. "This is the comprehensive project completion report that I compiled at the conclusion of our engagement with Hartwell Construction. It includes all deliverables, timeline documentation, and quality assessments from our consulting team. And in your professional opinion, based on this documentation, did Meridian fulfill all aspects of its contractual obligations to Hartwell?" Before my mother could answer, Mr. Santos rose from the defense table. "Objection, Your Honor. The witness is being asked to provide a legal conclusion about contractual compliance, which exceeds her area of expertise." All eyes turned to me. This was a routine objection that I'd ruled on dozens of times, but the weight of the moment felt enormous. My mother was looking directly at me, waiting for my decision, still processing the surreal reality that her daughter, the one she'd told would never succeed, was the ultimate authority in this room. "Sustained," I ruled firmly. "Mrs. Kelloway, please limit your testimony to the factual content of the documents you prepared, not legal conclusions about contractual compliance." Ms. Vance nodded and rephrased her question. "Mrs. Kelloway, based on the documentation in that report, were all of Meridian's promised deliverables completed and submitted to Hartwell according to the agreed-upon timeline?" "Yes," my mother answered, her voice growing stronger. "Every item listed in the original scope of work was completed and delivered on schedule." I made notes as the testimony continued, maintaining the careful neutrality that my position required. But internally, I was marveling at the cosmic irony of the situation. Here was my mother, testifying with authority about professional competence and successful project completion, while sitting 15 feet away from the daughter whose own professional success she had never acknowledged. The executives continued to nod approvingly as Ruth provided clear, factual answers that supported their case. David Hendricks actually smiled when she detailed the thoroughness of Meridian's quality control processes. These were the people my mother had always held up as examples of real success, and they clearly valued her contributions to their organization. Yet none of them knew that their star witness had spent decades telling her own daughter that she'd never amount to anything. None of them realized that the judge weighing their testimony was the same person Ruth had dismissed as impractical and unrealistic. As Ms. Vance concluded her direct examination, I prepared for what would inevitably be the most surreal cross-examination of my judicial career. My mother was about to be questioned by opposing counsel while I sat in judgment over every objection, every procedural matter, every aspect of how this testimony would unfold. The woman who had never believed in my capabilities was now completely subject to my authority, and there was absolutely nothing she could do about it. Mr. Santos approached the witness stand with the measured confidence of an attorney who had found something in the documentation that didn't quite add up. Cross-examination was always a delicate dance. The opportunity for opposing counsel to probe for inconsistencies, challenge assumptions, and sometimes expose uncomfortable truths that direct examination had glossed over. "Mrs. Kelloway," Santos began, holding a manila folder that looked considerably thinner than the comprehensive files my mother had been referencing, "you testified that all deliverables were completed according to schedule. Is that correct?" Yes, that's correct, Ruth replied, her posture straight and professional. And you personally oversaw the documentation of these deliverables? I coordinated the documentation process, yes. I didn't personally create every report, but I ensured that all materials were properly filed and accounted for. Santos nodded and moved closer to the witness stand. Mrs. Kelloway, I'm showing you what's been marked as Defense Exhibit A. Do you recognize this document? My mother accepted the paper and studied it carefully. I could see her brow furrow slightly as she read, the first sign that Santos might have found something that challenged her previous testimony. This appears to be an internal email from Thomas Brennan to several Meridian employees, including yourself, dated June 18th of last year. Yes, I remember this email. Could you read the subject line for the court, please? Ruth's voice became more cautious. The subject line reads, Hartwell Project, revised timeline due to compliance issues. Compliance issues, Santos repeated, letting the words hang in the air. Mrs. Kelloway, does this refresh your recollection about whether all deliverables were truly completed according to the original schedule? I watched my mother's face as she processed the implications of the question. This was the moment every witness dreaded, when their confident narrative suddenly encountered evidence that complicated the story they'd been telling. There were some adjustments to the timeline, she admitted, but ultimately all work was completed satisfactorily. Adjustments, Santos said. Mrs. Kelloway, according to this email chain, which continues for several pages, the adjustments you're referring to included a 6-week delay, while Meridian's consulting team addressed what Mr. Brennan called significant oversights in regulatory compliance research. Ms. Vance rose from the plaintiff's table. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is characterizing the document rather than allowing the witness to testify about its contents. This was the moment I'd been unconsciously dreading since recognizing my mother in the courtroom. A routine evidentiary ruling that would force me to exercise judicial authority while my mother watched from the witness stand, still processing the impossible reality of our reversed roles. Overruled, I said firmly, my voice carrying the weight of 4 years' experience making such decisions. Mr. Santos may continue his questioning, but I'll ask that you allow the witness to speak to the document's contents rather than characterizing them yourself. Santos nodded respectfully. Of course, Your Honor. He turned back to my mother. Mrs. Kelloway, looking at this email chain, can you tell the court what Mr. Brennan meant when he wrote significant oversights in regulatory compliance research? Ruth shifted uncomfortably in her chair. I could see her calculating how to answer truthfully while minimizing damage to her employer's case. This was exactly the kind of professional pressure she'd always handled with competence. But the added stress of having her daughter as the presiding judge was clearly affecting her usual confidence. Mr. Brennan discovered that our initial research had missed some updated zoning regulations that applied to Hartwell's proposed expansion, she said carefully. We needed additional time to ensure full compliance. And during this 6-week delay, Hartwell Construction was unable to proceed with their expansion plans? That's correct. Mrs. Kelloway, do you know what the financial impact of this delay was for Hartwell Construction? Ms. Vance stood again. Objection, Your Honor. The witness has already testified that she coordinated documentation, not financial analysis. This question calls for speculation beyond her area of expertise. I looked down at my mother, who was waiting for my ruling with the same deference any witness would show to a presiding judge. But in her eyes, I could see something else. A growing recognition of just how completely our roles had been reversed. Sustained, I ruled. Mr. Santos, please limit your questions to matters within the witness's direct knowledge and responsibility. Thank you, Your Honor, Santos replied. Mrs. Kelloway, did you personally document any communications from Hartwell expressing concern about the project delays? This question hit its mark. I watched my mother's face as she realized she'd have to acknowledge documentation that undermined Meridian's position. Yes, she said quietly. There were several emails from Mr. Hartwell expressing frustration about the timeline changes. And did these emails indicate that Hartwell was incurring additional costs due to the delays? Mr. Hartwell mentioned financial pressures, yes. Santos retrieved another document from his folder. Mrs. Kelloway, I'm showing you Defense Exhibit B. This is an email from Robert Hartwell to Thomas Brennan dated July 2nd. Could you read the highlighted portion for the court? Ruth accepted the document and read aloud. Tom, I need to be frank with you. These delays are killing us financially. We've got contractors on standby, equipment rental fees piling up, and a construction loan that's accruing interest daily. If Meridian can't get this regulatory work completed soon, we're going to have to consider whether we can afford to continue with this project. The courtroom fell silent as the implications of this testimony sank in. My mother had just been forced to read evidence that directly contradicted Meridian's claim that they had fulfilled their contractual obligations without causing harm to their client. I could see the Meridian executives behind the plaintiff's table exchanging concerned glances. David Hendricks was no longer checking his Rolex. He was leaning forward with the focused attention of someone realizing that their case might not be as straightforward as they'd assumed. Mrs. Kelloway, Santos continued, after receiving this email from Mr. Hartwell, did you forward it to anyone else within Meridian's organization? Yes, I forwarded it to Mr. Hendricks and Ms. Walsh, as per our standard protocol for client communications expressing concerns. And did you personally see any response from Meridian's leadership addressing Mr. Hartwell's financial concerns? Ruth hesitated, glancing briefly toward the plaintiff's table where her supervisors sat watching her testimony. There were internal discussions about the matter, but no formal response offering to address or compensate for the financial impact of the delays. Not that I documented, no. Santos paused, allowing the weight of this admission to settle over the courtroom. Then he did something that made my heart race with anticipation and dread. Mrs. Kelloway, he said, in your 15 years with Meridian Financial Services, have you ever had to testify in a legal proceeding before today? No, this is my first time. And in preparing for today's testimony, did any of Meridian's executives explain to you who would be presiding over this case? My mother's eyes flickered toward me, then back to Santos. They told me we'd be appearing before Judge Rivers in courtroom 7B. Judge Rivers, Santos repeated, and I could hear something in his voice that suggested he was building toward something significant. Mrs. Kelloway, do you know Judge Rivers personally? The question hung in the air like a live wire. My mother's face went pale as she realized where this line of questioning was headed. The Meridian executives were looking confused, unsure why defense counsel was asking about the witness's relationship with the judge. Ruth started, then stopped, looking directly at me for guidance on how to answer. This was the moment everything would change. Not just for our family, but for every person in that courtroom who thought they understood the dynamics of the case they were watching unfold. The silence in courtroom 7B stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Every person in the room was waiting for my mother's answer to Santos's question about whether she knew Judge Rivers personally. I could see Ruth's hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the witness stand, her professional composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of the impossible situation she found herself in. Ms. Vance looked confused, clearly wondering why opposing counsel was asking about her witness's relationship with the judge. The Meridian executives were leaning forward now, sensing that something significant was happening but unable to grasp what it might be. David Hendricks had that look of a man watching his carefully planned strategy begin to unravel in real time. Mrs. Kelloway, Santos prompted gently, the question was whether you know Judge Rivers personally. My mother's eyes met mine across the courtroom, and in that moment, 20 years of family history collided with the formal protocols of legal proceedings. She could lie, say she didn't know me, try to maintain some semblance of the professional distance that courtroom decorum demanded. But we both knew that would be perjury, and Ruth Kelloway, whatever her flaws as a mother, had always been scrupulously honest in her professional life. Yes, she whispered, so quietly that the court reporter had to lean forward to catch her words. I'm sorry, Mrs. Kelloway, could you speak up for the record? Yes, Ruth said more clearly, her voice carrying a strange mixture of pride and bewilderment. Yes, I know Judge Rivers personally. Santos nodded as if this was exactly what he'd expected to hear. And how do you know the judge, Mrs. Kelloway? The courtroom held its collective breath. I could see Ms. Vance starting to rise, probably to object on grounds of relevance. But something in the atmosphere made her pause, sensing that this revelation was about to reshape everything about the case she thought she was arguing. My mother straightened her shoulders, and for a moment I saw a flash of the woman who had raised me as a single parent, who had worked double shifts to keep us afloat, who had always done her duty even when it was difficult. Judge Rivers is my daughter. The reaction was immediate and electric. Ms. Vance's mouth fell open. David Hendricks actually stood up from his chair before catching himself and sitting back down. Jennifer Walsh dropped her phone. The court reporter's fingers froze over her stenotype machine. Even the bailiff, Officer Rodriguez, turned to stare at me with undisguised amazement. But the most profound reaction came from Thomas Brennan, the project manager, whose oversight had caused this whole dispute. He went completely white and began frantically whispering to his colleagues, clearly realizing that his company's key witness was the mother of the judge deciding their case. Santos allowed the shock to settle for a moment before continuing. Mrs. Kelloway, when Meridian's legal team informed you that you would be testifying in this case, did they tell you that your daughter would be the presiding judge? No, Ruth said, her voice stronger now that the secret was out. They told me we would be appearing before Judge Rivers, but I never connected. She paused, looking directly at me. I didn't know my daughter had become a judge. Those words hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Here was a woman testifying under oath that she didn't even know her own daughter had achieved one of the highest positions in the legal profession. The implications of such a profound disconnect between mother and child were immediately apparent to everyone present. Ms. Vance finally found her voice. Your Honor, I need to request an immediate recess to confer with my client about this development. But before I could respond, Santos continued his questioning. Mrs. Kelloway, when did you last speak with your daughter? Ruth's face flushed with embarrassment. It's been several years. Several years, Santos repeated. And during those years, were you aware that she had graduated from law school? Yes, I knew she had finished law school. Were you aware that she had been admitted to the bar? Yes, I believe so. Were you aware that she had been appointed as a judge? Ruth's voice became barely audible. No. Mrs. Kelloway, your daughter has been serving as a judge in this district for 4 years. In all that time, did you ever see a news article, a local newspaper announcement, any public information about her appointment? I watched my mother struggle with this question. The truth was that she had probably seen such announcements. My appointment had been covered extensively in the local media, but acknowledging that would mean admitting that she had deliberately chosen to ignore news about her daughter's success. I may have seen something, she admitted finally, but I didn't follow up on it. The courtroom was absolutely silent now. Even the usual background noise of shuffling papers and shifting in seats had stopped completely. Everyone present was witnessing something far more dramatic than a routine contract dispute. They were watching the public revelation of a family dynamic so dysfunctional that a mother could remain ignorant of her daughter's rise to judicial prominence. Santos pressed on, clearly understanding the powerful narrative he was uncovering. Mrs. Kelloway, you testified earlier that you've worked for Meridian Financial Services for over 15 years. Is that correct? Yes. And during that time, have you ever mentioned to your colleagues that your daughter was pursuing a career in law? Ruth's face reddened further. Not specifically, no. Have you ever mentioned to your supervisors that your daughter had become an attorney? No. Have you ever mentioned to anyone at Meridian that your daughter had become a judge? No. David Hendricks was staring at my mother with a mixture of shock and growing anger. I could see him calculating the potential implications for his company. How would it look that their key witness was estranged from her own daughter to such a degree that she had never even mentioned my existence to her colleagues? Santos moved in for what was clearly going to be the final devastating question of his cross-examination. Mrs. Kelloway, in the 15 years you've worked for Meridian Financial Services, has there ever been any discussion among the staff about Judge Cassandra Rivers? My mother looked confused. I don't understand. Has Judge Rivers' name ever come up in conversations at your workplace? Perhaps in discussions about local judges or legal matters affecting the company? I could see understanding dawning in Ruth's eyes, followed immediately by horror. She was beginning to realize that her colleagues might have been talking about me, praising my legal work, discussing my cases, perhaps even expressing respect for my judicial decisions, and she had never made the connection. There may have been, she said weakly. Mrs. Kelloway, have you ever heard your colleagues speak positively about Judge Rivers' reputation for fairness and competence? Yes, I think I have heard positive comments. And during these conversations, did you ever think to mention that Judge Rivers was your daughter? The question hung in the air like an indictment. My mother sat in stunned silence, finally understanding the full scope of her disconnection from my life and achievements. She had worked for 15 years in a professional environment where my reputation was known and respected, and she had never once claimed me as her daughter. No, she whispered. I never mentioned it. Santos nodded with satisfaction. No further questions, Your Honor. As he returned to his table, the courtroom remained in shocked silence. The Meridian executives were huddled in frantic conversation, clearly trying to figure out how this revelation would affect their case. Ms. Vance looked like she was still processing the impossibility of what she'd just witnessed. And my mother sat in the witness stand, finally confronting the reality that the daughter she had dismissed and ignored had not only succeeded beyond her wildest imagination, but had been quietly earning the professional respect of her own colleagues, while she remained obliviously proud of her association with their company. For the first time in our relationship, Ruth Kelloway was beginning to understand exactly what and who she had lost. The aftermath of my mother's admission rippled through courtroom 7B like an earthquake, with everyone trying to process the implications of what they'd just witnessed. The professional veneer that had characterized the morning's proceedings had been completely shattered, replaced by something far more raw and human. Ms. Vance was the first to recover, though her usual courtroom confidence had been replaced by barely controlled panic. Your Honor, she said, rising unsteadily to her feet, given this unexpected revelation, I must formally request an immediate recess so that the plaintiff can evaluate whether there are any conflicts of interest that might affect these proceedings. I could see her mind racing, trying to calculate the legal and public relations nightmare that was unfolding. Here was Meridian's star witness, a woman they had trusted to present their case professionally and credibly, revealing under cross-examination that she was so estranged from her own daughter that she hadn't even known about her judicial appointment. The optics were devastating. Behind the plaintiff's table, the Meridian executives were engaged in increasingly frantic, whispered conversations. David Hendricks kept glancing between my mother and me, his face flushed with what I recognized as barely contained rage. He was probably calculating how many times he and his colleagues had spoken positively about Judge Rivers in front of Ruth, praising my decisions or my reputation, while she sat there knowing that the judge they respected was her own daughter whom she had dismissed as a failure. Jennifer Walsh had pulled out her phone and was typing rapidly, likely sending urgent messages to corporate headquarters about the crisis that was unfolding in what should have been a routine contract dispute. The younger executive, Thomas Brennan, looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. His face had gone from pale to green, and he kept shaking his head as if he could somehow undo the revelations of the past 10 minutes. But the most profound transformation was happening in my mother herself. Ruth sat in the witness stand with her hands folded in her lap, staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't the dismissive look I remembered from my childhood, or the polite indifference she'd shown toward my achievements. It was something much more complex, a mixture of shock, dawning recognition, and what might have been the beginning of genuine remorse. "Mrs. Kelloway," I said formally, "you may step down from the witness stand." She stood slowly, as if moving through water, and walked back toward the plaintiff's table. But as she passed the gallery seating, several court observers turned to stare at her with undisguised curiosity. Word was already beginning to spread among the courthouse staff and the few members of the public who had been present for what they thought would be a routine civil hearing. "I'll grant a 30-minute recess," I announced, striking my gavel. "All parties will reconvene at 2:15. As the courtroom began to empty, I could hear the urgent conversations starting immediately. Court clerks were whispering to each other near the back of the room. A law student who had been observing the proceedings pulled out her phone, probably already composing messages about the incredible family drama she'd just witnessed unfold in open court. I retreated to my chambers, but even there, the magnitude of what had just happened was impossible to escape. My secretary, Mrs. Patterson, knocked tentatively on my door within minutes of the recess beginning. "Judge Rivers," she said carefully, "there are already 3 reporters in the lobby asking about the case, and I've had calls from 2 local news stations." Of course there were reporters. In a courthouse, news traveled faster than wildfire, especially when it involved something as unprecedented as a judge presiding over a case where her own estranged mother was a key witness. By evening, this would probably be the lead story on every local news broadcast. "Please refer all media inquiries to the standard courthouse protocol," I told her. "No comments on ongoing proceedings." But I knew that wouldn't stop the story from spreading. Social media would be buzzing within hours. Legal blogs would pick it up by tomorrow. The image of a successful judge whose own mother didn't even know about her achievements would become a powerful symbol of family dysfunction and professional success achieved despite, rather than because of, family support. Back in the courtroom, I could see through the window in my chamber door that the Meridian team had gathered in an intense huddle near the plaintiff's table. Miss Vance was gesticulating emphatically while David Hendricks spoke rapidly into his phone. Thomas Brennan sat with his head in his hands, probably realizing that his career at Meridian might not survive the public relations disaster that was about to engulf the company. My mother stood alone near the court reporter's station, looking lost and overwhelmed. For the first time since I'd entered law school, I felt a flicker of sympathy for her. She had walked into this courtroom expecting to perform her professional duties competently and help her employer win their case. Instead, she had been forced to publicly confront the reality of our relationship in the most humiliating way possible. Officer Rodriguez approached me as I prepared to return to the bench. "Judge," he said quietly, "I've been working in this courthouse for 12 years, and I've never seen anything like what just happened in there." "It's certainly unusual," I agreed. "The way that attorney handled the cross-examination, he clearly knew about your relationship with the witness beforehand." That thought had occurred to me as well. Santos's questions had been too precise, too strategic to be the result of courtroom improvisation. Somehow he had discovered that Ruth Kelloway was my mother and had planned his cross-examination accordingly. It was brilliant legal strategy, turning what should have been routine witness testimony into a devastating exposure of family dysfunction that undermined the credibility of Meridian's entire case. As the recess period drew to a close, I watched the various parties file back into the courtroom. The atmosphere was completely different now. The confidence and routine professionalism that had characterized the morning's session had been replaced by tension and uncertainty. Ms. Vance looked like she had aged 5 years during the 30-minute break. The Meridian executives filed in with the grim expressions of people attending a funeral. Thomas Brennan kept his eyes fixed on the floor, clearly hoping to avoid any attention that might further associate him with the disaster unfolding around his company's lawsuit. The defense team, by contrast, had an air of barely suppressed triumph. Santos was arranging his papers with the satisfaction of an attorney who knew he had just delivered a knockout blow. Robert Hartwell, the contractor who had seemed overmatched by Meridian's corporate legal team that morning, now sat with the confidence of someone who realized the tide had turned decisively in his favor. And my mother took her seat behind the plaintiff's table like a woman walking to her own execution. She kept her eyes down, avoiding the curious stares from the gallery and the obvious frustration radiating from her employers. As I called the court back to order, I realized that whatever happened next in these proceedings, nothing would ever be the same. The careful professional distance I had maintained throughout my judicial career had been shattered by the revelation of my personal connection to this case. The respect and authority I had built over 4 years on the bench would now be forever linked to the story of the judge, whose own mother had dismissed her potential so completely that she didn't even know about her daughter's success. But there was something else, too. For the first time in my adult life, I had been forced to confront our relationship in a public forum where my mother couldn't simply walk away or change the subject. She had been compelled, under oath, to acknowledge not just my existence but my success. And in doing so, she had been forced to confront the magnitude of her own failure as a parent. The question now was what would happen next. "Your Honor," Ms. Vance began as soon as I had called the court back to order, "the plaintiff would like to formally request that you recuse yourself from this case due to the personal relationship that has been revealed between yourself and our witness." I had been expecting this motion, of course. It was the logical legal response to what had just been disclosed. But the timing and manner of the request carried an undertone of desperation that everyone in the courtroom could detect. "On what specific grounds are you requesting recusal, Ms. Vance?" I asked, maintaining the formal tone that judicial proceedings required even as we all navigated this unprecedented situation. "Your Honor, the appearance of impropriety created by presiding over a case in which your own mother is a key witness creates an untenable conflict of interest that could compromise the integrity of these proceedings." Santos rose immediately from the defense table. "Your Honor, the defense strongly objects to this motion for recusal." The plaintiff's witness relationship to the court was not disclosed during discovery, despite their obligation to provide such information. Moreover, this relationship was only revealed through our cross-examination. We would argue that any appearance of impropriety stems from the plaintiff's failure to properly vet their witness list, not from any action or knowledge on the part of the court. It was a brilliant legal argument. Santos was essentially arguing that Meridian's own incompetence in failing to discover that their star witness was the judge's mother meant they shouldn't be allowed to benefit from a recusal that would delay the proceedings and give them time to regroup. Ms. Vance's face reddened. "Your Honor, there is no way the defense could have known about this relationship unless—" She stopped mid-sentence, clearly realizing where that line of reasoning would lead. If she accused Santos of somehow improperly researching my personal background, she would be opening a can of worms that could lead to sanctions against her own team for failing to conduct basic due diligence on their witnesses. "Unless what, Ms. Vance?" I asked. "I withdraw that line of argument, Your Honor." I could see the Meridian executives behind the plaintiff's table growing more agitated by the minute. David Hendricks was leaning forward, clearly wanting to intervene in the legal arguments, while Jennifer Walsh was typing furiously on her phone, probably coordinating with corporate lawyers about the rapidly escalating crisis. "Your Honor," Santos continued, "we would further argue that any recusal at this point would be prejudicial to our client's interests. Mr. Hartwell has already incurred significant legal expenses preparing for this hearing. The revelation about the witness's relationship to the court actually strengthens our position that Meridian failed to conduct proper due diligence, both in this legal matter and in their original consulting work." I paused, considering the arguments. From a purely legal standpoint, Santos was correct. The relationship between my mother and myself had been disclosed through proper cross-examination, not through any improper ex parte communication or judicial knowledge. If anything, the revelation demonstrated that I had maintained complete professional separation from my personal life. But there was another consideration that I suspected neither attorney was fully grasping yet. The story of what had happened in this courtroom was going to spread far beyond the legal community. By tomorrow, this would be news. By next week, it might be national news. The optics of a judge refusing to recuse herself from a case involving her estranged mother could become a significant judicial ethics issue. "I'll take this motion under advisement," I said finally. "However, given the unique circumstances that have been revealed, I believe it's appropriate to continue with today's proceedings while I consider the recusal question. Ms. Vance, do you have any redirect examination for Mrs. Kelloway?" The question seemed to catch Ms. Vance off guard. She had been so focused on the recusal motion that she apparently hadn't prepared for the possibility that the case might continue immediately. Your Honor, given the circumstances, we would request a continuance to allow us to prepare appropriate redirect examination. Mr. Santos, do you have any objection to a brief continuance? Santos stood, and I could see the strategic calculation in his expression. A continuance would give Meridian time to regroup and potentially find a way to minimize the damage from my mother's devastating testimony. But it would also give the media more time to pick up the story, which could ultimately work in his client's favor by creating public pressure against the corporate giant that had failed to properly manage their legal case. No objection, Your Honor, provided the continuance is brief and limited in scope. Very well. This matter will be continued until Thursday morning at 9 a.m. That will give all parties 48 hours to prepare for the completion of Mrs. Kelloway's testimony and any additional witnesses. I struck my gavel. This court is adjourned. As the courtroom began to empty, I noticed that several people lingered, clearly hoping to witness whatever interaction might occur between my mother and me. Ruth remained seated behind the plaintiff's table, apparently uncertain about what she should do or where she should go. The Meridian executives were engaged in what looked like an increasingly heated discussion with Ms. Vance. I could hear fragments of their conversation as I gathered my papers. Complete disaster. How could you not know? And corporate's going to have questions about this. David Hendricks broke away from the group and approached my mother. Even from the bench, I could see that he was struggling to control his temper. "Ruth," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger, "we need to talk. Immediately." Thomas Brennan joined them, his face still pale with shock. "Mrs. Kelloway, I don't understand how this happened. When we briefed you on this case, didn't you recognize the judge's name?" My mother's response was barely audible, but I could see her shaking her head, probably explaining that she had never connected Judge Rivers with Cassandra, the daughter she had dismissed and ignored. Jennifer Walsh approached the group, still holding her phone. "Ruth, I just got off the phone with the legal department. They want to see you in the office immediately. This is going to require some damage control." The scene unfolding before me was both satisfying and deeply uncomfortable. My mother, who had spent 15 years building her professional reputation at Meridian, was now facing the consequences of her personal failures in the most public and humiliating way possible. Her supervisors, the same people she had always held up as examples of professional success, were treating her with barely concealed contempt. As the Meridian team filed toward the exit, Ruth finally looked up at the bench where I sat. Our eyes met for a moment, and I saw something in her expression that I hadn't seen since I was a child. Uncertainty, vulnerability, and perhaps the beginning of genuine remorse. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. What could she possibly say in this moment? How do you apologize for 20 years of dismissal and neglect in the middle of a courthouse corridor while your employers stand behind you, calculating the damage to their corporate interests? Instead, she simply nodded, a small, barely perceptible gesture that might have been acknowledgement or apology, or just confusion. Then she turned and followed her supervisors toward the exit. Santos approached the bench as the courtroom finally emptied. "Your Honor, I want to assure you that we conducted all our preparation for this case through proper legal channels. We had no advance knowledge of the family relationship." I understand, Mr. Santos. Your cross-examination was thorough and professional. He smiled slightly. Thank you, Your Honor. If I may say so, this case has taken some unexpected turns. After he left, I sat alone in the empty courtroom for several minutes, processing what had just occurred. In 4 years on the bench, I had presided over hundreds of cases involving corporate disputes, family conflicts, and personal drama. But I had never been personally involved in the drama unfolding in my own courtroom. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from my law clerk. Judge, there are reporters waiting in the lobby downstairs. Channel 7 and Channel 12 both have crews here. Mrs. Patterson says there have been calls from 3 different newspapers. The story was already spreading just as I had predicted. By tonight, the entire legal community would be talking about the judge who discovered her estranged mother was testifying in her courtroom. By tomorrow, it would be a human interest story about family relationships and professional success. But beyond the media attention and the legal complications, there was something more personal happening here. For the first time in our adult relationship, my mother and I had been forced into the same space, with her compelled to acknowledge not just my existence but my authority. The woman who had told me I'd never amount to anything had been required, under oath and in front of her employers, to address me as Your Honor. The question now was what would happen when we inevitably had to face each other again on Thursday morning. Thursday morning arrived with an intensity I hadn't experienced since my first day on the bench 4 years earlier. The courthouse parking lot was dotted with news vans, and I could see reporters stationed near the main entrance as my driver pulled around to the judge's private entrance. The story had indeed spread exactly as I'd predicted. My secretary handed me a stack of phone messages when I arrived at my chambers. Judge Rivers, we've had calls from the State Bar Journal, Legal Affairs Weekly, 3 different law schools asking about interviews for their publications, and something called Estranged Families Reconciliation Network wanting to discuss your story. I set the messages aside without reading them. Whatever media circus was building around this case, my focus had to remain on the legal proceedings themselves. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't curious about how my mother had spent the past 48 hours. At exactly 9 a.m., I entered courtroom 7B to find it packed beyond its normal capacity. The gallery was filled with court observers, local attorneys who had clearly come to witness the continuation of what was already being called the most unusual family drama in county legal history, and at least a dozen people I didn't recognize who were probably reporters despite the no cameras rule in the courthouse. The Meridian team looked like they hadn't slept. Ms. Vance's usual polished appearance seemed strained, and I could see papers and file folders scattered across their table in a way that suggested frantic, last-minute preparation. David Hendricks sat rigidly in his chair, staring straight ahead with the expression of a man who was mentally calculating the professional damage this case was causing him personally. But it was my mother who captured most of my attention. Ruth sat behind the plaintiff's table wearing a different outfit than Tuesday, a subdued gray suit that seemed deliberately chosen to draw as little attention as possible. Her face looked drawn, and there were dark circles under her eyes that suggested she had spent the past 2 days in the same sleepless state as her employers. More significantly, she was sitting alone. On Tuesday, she had been surrounded by the comfortable camaraderie of her Meridian colleagues. Today, there was a visible distance between her and the executives. Thomas Brennan had moved to a seat several feet away, and Jennifer Walsh was pointedly avoiding eye contact with her. The message was clear. Ruth Kelloway was no longer considered a trusted member of the Meridian team. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Cassandra Rivers," Officer Rodriguez announced, and I watched my mother stand with everyone else, her movements mechanical and uncertain. As I took my seat, Ms. Vance rose immediately. "Your Honor, before we proceed with today's testimony, I need to address several matters that have arisen since our last session." "Proceed, Ms. Vance." "First, Your Honor, I want to formally notify the court that Meridian Financial Services has conducted an internal review of this matter and has determined that Mrs. Kelloway's continued employment with the company may not be in the best interests of either party. The words hit the courtroom like a physical blow. My mother's face went white, and I saw her hands begin to tremble. After 15 years of dedicated service, Meridian was essentially announcing in open court that they were considering firing her because of the embarrassment her family situation had caused them. Furthermore, Ms. Vance continued, we want to address any concerns about the appropriateness of Mrs. Kelloway continuing as a witness in this matter, given the personal complications that have been revealed. Santos was on his feet immediately. Your Honor, the defense objects to any attempt to withdraw this witness, after her cross-examination has already revealed critical information favorable to our client. The plaintiff cannot simply abandon their witness because her testimony didn't support their case as strongly as they had hoped. I could see the strategy immediately. Meridian wanted to distance themselves from my mother now that she had become a liability, both professionally and legally. But Santos wasn't going to let them escape the consequences of their own poor preparation. Mrs. Kelloway, I said, looking directly at my mother, do you wish to continue your testimony, or do you have any objection to completing the proceedings in this matter? Ruth stood slowly, and for a moment I thought she might request to be excused from further testimony. But then she straightened her shoulders with a gesture that reminded me of the woman who had raised me as a single parent, who had worked double shifts to support us, who had always completed her responsibilities regardless of personal cost. Your Honor, she said, her voice steady despite the obvious strain, I am prepared to complete my testimony as required. It was the first time in our adult relationship that I had heard genuine strength in her voice when she addressed me directly. Not dismissal, not condescension, but actual respect. Very well. Ms. Vance, do you have redirect examination for this witness? Ms. Vance looked like she wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Yes, Your Honor, but it will be brief. She approached the witness stand where my mother was settling herself with the same professional composure she had maintained throughout her Meridian career, despite the fact that her employers were essentially abandoning her in real time. Mrs. Kelloway, Ms. Vance began carefully, despite the personal circumstances that have been revealed during these proceedings, does that change the factual accuracy of your testimony regarding Meridian's completion of their contractual obligations to Hartwell Construction? No, Ruth answered firmly. The documentation I presented accurately reflects the work that was completed and the timeline of the project. And in your professional opinion, based on your 15 years of experience managing similar projects, was the quality of Meridian's work consistent with industry standards? Santos rose to object. Your Honor, as previously established, the witness is not qualified to render expert opinions about industry standards. Sustained, I ruled. Mrs. Kelloway, please limit your testimony to your direct knowledge and observations. Ms. Vance tried a different approach. Mrs. Kelloway, during your 15 years with Meridian, have you ever known the company to deliberately deliver substandard work to a client? No, I have not. It was competent redirect examination, focused on rehabilitating my mother's credibility and reinforcing Meridian's position. But I could see that Ms. Vance's heart wasn't in it. The attorney-client relationship had been fundamentally damaged by the revelations of Tuesday's session, and everyone in the courtroom could sense it. No further questions, Ms. Vance said, returning to her table. Santos approached for what I knew would be the crucial moment of the entire proceeding. Mrs. Kelloway, you testified that in 15 years with Meridian, you've never known them to deliberately deliver substandard work. Is that correct? Yes. But you also testified on Tuesday that there were significant delays in the Hartwell project due to what Mr. Brennan called, quote, oversights in regulatory compliance research. Is that also correct? Yes. Mrs. Kelloway, would you characterize failing to research applicable zoning regulations as, quote, substandard work? My mother paused, clearly struggling with a question that forced her to choose between loyalty to her employer and factual accuracy under oath. I would characterize it as an oversight that required correction, she said carefully. An oversight that cost Mr. Hartwell's company 6 weeks of delays and significant financial hardship? That appears to be accurate, yes, Santos moved closer to the witness stand. Mrs. Kelloway, I want to ask you about something else. During your 15 years at Meridian, have you ever heard your colleagues speak about Judge Rivers? The question clearly caught my mother off guard. I'm sorry? Have you ever heard coworkers, supervisors, or executives at Meridian mention Judge Cassandra Rivers in professional contexts? Ruth's face reddened as she realized where this was heading. Yes, I have heard the judge's name mentioned. And what was the nature of these conversations? Generally, positive comments about her reputation and her decisions. Mrs. Kelloway, have you ever heard David Hendricks, your direct supervisor, speak positively about Judge Rivers' handling of corporate litigation? My mother glanced toward the plaintiff's table, where David Hendricks was staring at her with barely controlled fury. She was being forced to acknowledge that her supervisor had praised me professionally while she had never even told him I was her daughter. Yes, I have heard Mr. Hendricks speak positively about Judge Rivers. And during these conversations, Mrs. Kelloway, did you ever feel proud that your colleagues were praising your daughter's professional accomplishments? The courtroom fell completely silent. This was the question that cut to the heart of everything, not just the legal issues in the case, but the fundamental dysfunction of our family relationship. My mother sat in the witness stand, looking directly at me, and for the first time in 20 years, I saw genuine pain in her eyes. Not the dismissive frustration she'd always shown toward my ambitions, but actual grief for what had been lost between us. I wasn't proud, she said quietly, because I had convinced myself that my daughter was someone who would never succeed. And when my colleagues praised Judge Rivers, I never connected their respect with the child I had failed to believe in. The admission hung in the air like a confession, more devastating than any legal testimony could have been. Santos allowed my mother's devastating admission to settle over the courtroom before continuing. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of the court reporter's fingers moving across her stenotype machine and the distant hum of air conditioning. No further questions, Your Honor, Santos said finally, his voice respectful of the gravity of what had just been revealed. As my mother stepped down from the witness stand, I could see her legs were unsteady. The weight of her public confession, that she had failed to believe in her own daughter even while her colleagues praised the daughter's professional accomplishments, seemed to have physically depleted her. Ms. Vance, I said, do you have any additional witnesses? Ms. Vance stood, but her usual courtroom confidence had been completely shattered. Your Honor, given the circumstances that have developed during these proceedings, Meridian Financial Services would like to request a brief recess to reconsider our litigation strategy. It was a desperate move. The company's star witness had just publicly admitted that their consulting work contained significant oversights, and worse, had revealed a personal dysfunction so profound that it undermined her credibility as a professional. No amount of strategic reconsideration could undo the damage that had been done. Mr. Santos, do you have any objection to a brief recess? No objection, Your Honor. 15 minutes, I announced, striking my gavel. As the courtroom began to empty for recess, I noticed that my mother didn't follow the Meridian team toward their usual conference area. Instead, she remained seated in the front row, staring at her hands, apparently abandoned by the employers who had once valued her organizational skills and professional competence. The dynamics in the corridor outside the courtroom were immediately apparent to anyone who cared to observe them. The Meridian executives had clustered near the elevators, engaged in what looked like a crisis management session. David Hendricks was speaking rapidly into his phone, probably coordinating with corporate headquarters about damage control strategies. Jennifer Walsh was reviewing documents with Ms. Vance, both women looking increasingly desperate as they tried to salvage something from the disaster their case had become. But the most telling detail was that none of them were including my mother in their discussions. The woman who had managed their documentation, coordinated their communications, and served as their institutional memory for 15 years, was now being treated as a liability rather than a valued team member. Meanwhile, the defense team was holding their own conference near the courthouse's main entrance, and their mood was entirely different. Robert Hartwell looked like a man who had just watched his David and Goliath story play out exactly as he had hoped. Santos was reviewing his notes with the satisfaction of an attorney who knew he had just delivered one of the most effective cross-examinations of his career. But it wasn't just the legal teams whose attention had been captured by the morning's proceedings. Word had spread throughout the courthouse with remarkable speed, and I could see clusters of court staff, other attorneys, and courthouse regulars engaged in intense conversations about what they had witnessed. My bailiff, Officer Rodriguez, approached me as I prepared to return to the bench. "Judge," he said quietly, "I've never seen anything like what just happened in there. That woman's testimony, the way she admitted she didn't believe in her own daughter while her coworkers were praising you, it's going to be talked about for years." He was right, of course. This case was already transcending its original boundaries as a routine contract dispute. The human drama that had unfolded, a successful judge discovering that her estranged mother was testifying in her courtroom, followed by the revelation that the mother had spent years hearing colleagues praise her daughter without making the connection, was the kind of story that would become courthouse legend. When I returned to the bench, the courtroom had filled beyond its normal capacity. Word had clearly spread during the recess, and the gallery now included people who hadn't been present for the morning session. I recognized several prominent local attorneys who had apparently rearranged their schedules to witness whatever would happen next in what was already being called the Kelloway case. Ms. Vance rose as soon as I called the court back to order. "Your Honor, after conferring with our client during the recess, Meridian Financial Services would like to explore the possibility of reaching a settlement agreement with the defendant." The admission drew audible murmurs from the gallery. After days of aggressive litigation and confident assertions about their contractual rights, Meridian was essentially conceding defeat. The combination of my mother's testimony about project oversights and the public relations nightmare created by the family drama had made continuing the case untenable. Santos stood immediately. "Your Honor, while we appreciate the plaintiff's interest in settlement discussions, we believe this matter should be resolved through the court's judgment rather than private negotiations. The testimony that has been presented raises important questions about corporate accountability that deserve public resolution." It was a brilliant strategic move. Santos recognized that the public attention surrounding this case had transformed it into something much larger than a simple contract dispute. A court victory would carry far more weight than a private settlement, both for his client's reputation and for the broader principle of holding corporations accountable for professional oversights. "Your Honor," Ms. Vance said, her voice betraying her desperation, "we believe that private settlement discussions would be in the best interests of all parties, including considering the personal circumstances that have been revealed." She was essentially asking me to facilitate a settlement to avoid further public embarrassment for my family. But the suggestion that I might tailor my judicial decisions based on personal considerations was insulting to everything I had worked to achieve as a judge. "Ms. Vance," I said firmly, "this court's decisions will be based solely on the legal merits of the case as presented. Personal circumstances are not relevant to judicial proceedings." The rebuke was gentle but clear, and I could see several attorneys in the gallery nodding with approval. Whatever personal drama had been revealed during this case, I was maintaining the professional standards that my position required. "Does the plaintiff have any additional witnesses or evidence to present?" I continued. Ms. Vance looked toward the Meridian executives, who were engaged in frantic, whispered consultation. Finally, David Hendricks shook his head slightly, apparently recognizing that any additional testimony would likely only make their position worse. "No, Your Honor, the plaintiff rests." "Mr. Santos, does the defense wish to present any witnesses or additional evidence?" Santos smiled slightly. "Your Honor, based on the testimony that has already been presented, we believe our case has been adequately established. The defense rests." And, just like that, the evidentiary phase of the case was complete. Both sides had rested their cases, which meant that all that remained were closing arguments and my final judgment. But everyone in that courtroom knew that this case had already produced something far more significant than a routine legal ruling. The testimony that had been presented, particularly my mother's devastating admission about failing to believe in her daughter's potential, had created a public record of family dysfunction and professional redemption that would resonate far beyond the specific contractual issues between Meridian and Hartwell. As I prepared to hear closing arguments, I realized that whatever judgment I ultimately rendered, the real verdict had already been delivered. The daughter who had been dismissed as impractical and unrealistic was presiding over legal proceedings that would determine the fate of the company that employed her mother. The woman who had told me I'd never amount to anything was sitting in my courtroom, having been compelled to address me as Your Honor, while publicly acknowledging her failure to recognize my success. The reversal of our roles was now complete and permanently part of the public record. The closing arguments were almost anticlimactic after the drama that had preceded them. Ms. Vance delivered a perfunctory defense of Meridian's position, focusing on technical contract compliance, while carefully avoiding any mention of the project delays or oversight issues that my mother's testimony had revealed. Her presentation lacked the confidence and conviction that had characterized her opening statement just days earlier. Santos, by contrast, delivered his closing with the passion of an attorney who knew he was arguing not just for his client but for a principle. He methodically reviewed the evidence of Meridian's regulatory oversights, the financial impact on Hartwell Construction, and the company's failure to take responsibility for their mistakes. But he never mentioned the personal drama that had dominated the proceedings. He didn't need to. Everyone in the courtroom understood that the credibility issues surrounding Meridian's key witness had fatally undermined their case. Your Honor, Santos concluded, this case is fundamentally about accountability. When a consulting firm accepts payment to provide professional services, they have an obligation to perform those services competently. The evidence has clearly shown that Meridian Financial Services failed to meet that standard, and Mr. Hartwell's company should not bear the financial burden of their professional oversights. After both sides had presented their arguments, I announced that I would issue my written decision within 1 week, as was standard for civil matters of this complexity. But as I struck my gavel to adjourn the proceedings, I knew that the real impact of this case would be measured not in legal precedents, but in the personal and professional consequences that were already beginning to unfold. The moment court was adjourned, the courthouse corridor erupted into controlled chaos. Reporters who had been waiting outside the courtroom immediately surrounded both legal teams, though their questions focused as much on the family drama as on the legal issues. I could hear fragments of their inquiries as I gathered my materials. Can you comment on the judge's relationship with the witness? How did this family situation affect your litigation strategy? Will there be an ethics investigation? But the most intense drama was playing out near the elevators, where the Meridian executives had cornered my mother in what appeared to be a heated confrontation. I couldn't hear their conversation from the bench, but their body language told the story clearly enough. David Hendricks was gesturing emphatically while speaking in low, urgent tones. Jennifer Walsh stood with her arms crossed, her expression cold and unforgiving. Thomas Brennan kept glancing nervously toward the reporters, clearly worried about being associated with what had become a public relations disaster. My mother stood in the center of this group, no longer the confident professional who had entered the courthouse on Tuesday morning. The woman who had managed Meridian's operations with competence and dedication for 15 years was now being treated as the source of their corporate embarrassment. Officer Rodriguez approached me as I prepared to leave the bench. Judge, there's a situation developing out there that you should be aware of. The Meridian people are, well, they're not handling this well. Through the window of my chamber door, I could see that the confrontation near the elevators had intensified. David Hendricks appeared to be speaking more aggressively, his face flushed with anger. My mother had taken a step backward, clearly intimidated by the hostility she was facing from her longtime employers. Mrs. Patterson, I said to my secretary, please ask Officer Rodriguez to ensure that all parties are able to leave the courthouse safely and without harassment. It was a careful intervention, enough to protect my mother from what appeared to be escalating workplace retaliation, but not so much as to compromise my judicial neutrality. But I found myself surprisingly concerned about her well-being as she faced the professional consequences of our family dysfunction becoming public. Within an hour of the court's adjournment, my phone began ringing with interview requests from legal journalists, courthouse reporters, and even national news outlets that had picked up the story through social media. The tale of a judge presiding over a case involving her estranged mother, a mother who hadn't even known about her daughter's judicial appointment, was exactly the kind of human interest story that transcended local news boundaries. My law clerk brought me a stack of printouts from various news websites and legal blogs that had already posted preliminary stories about the case. The headlines ranged from the factual, "Judge discovers mother is witness in her courtroom," to the sensational, "Family dysfunction exposed in corporate lawsuit." But all of them captured the essential irony of the situation. A successful professional whose own mother had dismissed her potential so thoroughly that she hadn't even known about her daughter's achievements. The most detailed coverage came from Legal Affairs Weekly, which had apparently assigned a reporter to cover the story in depth. Their article, published online just hours after the court session ended, included quotes from courthouse observers and legal experts about the unprecedented nature of what had occurred. In 30 years of practicing law in this district, one attorney was quoted as saying, "I've never seen anything like what happened in Judge Rivers' courtroom." The professionalism she maintained while presiding over such a personally difficult situation was remarkable. Another legal expert commented on the broader implications. This case raises fascinating questions about family dynamics and professional success. Here was a woman whose colleagues respected her daughter's judicial work without knowing they were related. It speaks to how completely estranged this family had become. But it was the final quote in the article that hit me most powerfully. It came from a family therapist who specialized in estranged family relationships. What we witnessed in that courtroom was a moment of forced recognition. For years, this mother had been able to maintain her dismissive narrative about her daughter because they had no contact. But when she was compelled to address her as "Your Honor" in a public setting, that narrative collapsed completely. The question now is whether either of them can build something new from the ruins of their old relationship. By evening, my answering machine at home was filled with messages from reporters, legal scholars, family counselors, and even television producers asking about documentary rights to the story. The local news had led with the story on both the 6 p.m. and 11 p.m. broadcasts, using courthouse security footage of the various parties entering and leaving the building. But perhaps most significantly, I received a call from the chief judge of our district, Harold Morrison, who had served on the bench for 22 years and commanded enormous respect throughout the legal community. "Cassandra," he said, his voice carrying the weight of his position, "I wanted to call personally to commend you on your handling of what must have been an extraordinarily difficult situation. Maintaining judicial neutrality under those circumstances required tremendous professionalism." "Thank you, Chief Judge. I tried to ensure that the personal issues didn't compromise the legal proceedings." "You succeeded completely," he replied. "But I also wanted you to know that this case is going to have consequences beyond the immediate legal issues. The State Judicial Ethics Committee has already received inquiries about whether your handling of the matter met appropriate standards. I've reviewed the transcripts and spoken with court observers, and I'm confident that you maintained proper judicial conduct throughout. But you should be prepared for some formal review of the matter." It wasn't unexpected, but it was still sobering. The case that had started as a routine contract dispute was now going to require me to defend my judicial ethics to state oversight authorities. The personal cost of our family's dysfunction was expanding beyond the courthouse walls. After hanging up with Chief Judge Morrison, I sat in my apartment reviewing the events of the past week. The daughter, who had been told she'd never amount to anything, had not only achieved judicial office, but had maintained her professional integrity while presiding over the most personally challenging case of her career. But there was still one more day to go. Tomorrow, I would have to render my final judgment in Meridian Financial Services versus Hartwell Construction Group, a decision that would officially close this extraordinary chapter while creating permanent legal precedent from our family's very public reckoning. The question that remained was whether my mother and I would ever be able to move beyond the courtroom drama that had forced us to confront the reality of our relationship. 1 week later, I issued my written decision in Meridian Financial Services versus Hartwell Construction Group. The ruling was straightforward from a legal perspective. I found in favor of Hartwell Construction, determining that Meridian's regulatory oversights constituted a material breach of their consulting contract, and awarded damages covering both the financial losses from project delays and legal costs. It was a decision I would have reached regardless of any personal circumstances, based purely on the evidence presented. But everyone understood that this case would be remembered not for its legal precedent, but for the extraordinary human drama that had unfolded in my courtroom. The aftermath continued to ripple outward in ways I hadn't anticipated. The State Judicial Ethics Committee concluded their review within 2 weeks, issuing a formal statement that my conduct had been exemplary under extraordinarily challenging personal circumstances, and that I had maintained appropriate judicial neutrality throughout proceedings of unprecedented complexity. The review actually enhanced my reputation within the legal community rather than damaging it. Legal scholars began citing the case in academic articles about judicial ethics and family dynamics. 3 different law schools invited me to speak about maintaining professional standards under personal pressure. The National Association of Women Judges asked me to deliver the keynote address at their annual conference on the topic, "When Personal and Professional Worlds Collide." But the most significant consequences were playing out in the lives of the people who had been at the center of the courtroom drama. David Hendricks was quietly reassigned within Meridian's corporate structure, moving from his visible operations role to a position in regulatory compliance, where his association with the case would be less prominent. Jennifer Walsh survived professionally, but had to explain to corporate headquarters how their legal team had failed to conduct basic due diligence on their key witness. Thomas Brennan left Meridian entirely, accepting a position with a smaller consulting firm where his role in the regulatory oversights would be less of a career liability. The case had essentially ended his advancement prospects within corporate consulting. As for my mother, the consequences were exactly what I had expected. Meridian terminated her employment 3 weeks after the trial concluded, citing, quote, restructuring needs, rather than acknowledging the real reason for her dismissal. 15 years of competent, dedicated service had been erased by the embarrassment her family dysfunction had caused the company. I learned about her firing not from her but from a brief news item in the business section of the local paper. The article mentioned that Ruth Kelloway, the employee whose family relationship to Judge Rivers became public during recent corporate litigation, had been released as part of organizational changes at Meridian Financial Services. For 6 months after the trial, my mother and I had no contact. The media attention gradually faded, though the case continued to be discussed in legal and academic circles, as an example of maintaining professional standards under personal stress. I testified before the State Judicial Ethics Committee, spoke at several professional conferences, and gradually returned to the routine of presiding over less dramatic cases. Then, on a Tuesday morning in October, my secretary brought me an unusual message. "Judge Rivers, there's a Ruth Kelloway here to see you. She says it's personal, not related to any legal matter. She's waiting in the lobby." I hadn't seen or spoken to my mother since that day in the courtroom, when she had stepped down from the witness stand after admitting she had failed to believe in her daughter's potential. The image of her sitting alone in the front row, abandoned by her employers, had stayed with me despite my attempts to focus on the legal rather than personal aspects of the case. "Send her to my chambers in 10 minutes, I said finally. When she entered, I was struck by how much she had changed in the months since the trial. Ruth looked smaller somehow, less confident than the professional woman who had managed Meridian's operations for 15 years. She was wearing a simple blue dress instead of the corporate suits that had been her uniform, and her hair was styled differently, softer, less severely professional. "Cassandra," she said, then caught herself. "I'm sorry, I know I should probably call you Judge Rivers." "You can call me Cassandra," I said. "Please, sit down." She took the chair across from my desk, the same chair where attorneys and court officials usually sat to discuss legal matters. But this conversation would be about something much more personal than court business. "I wanted to apologize," she said without preamble. "Not just for what happened in the courtroom, but for everything. For 20 years of not believing in you. For dismissing your dreams as impractical. For not celebrating your achievements. For not even knowing that my own daughter had become a judge." I had imagined this conversation many times over the months since the trial, but hearing the actual words was still powerful. "I also wanted you to know," she continued, "that losing my job was the best thing that could have happened to me. For the first time in years, I had to think about who I was beyond just being a Meridian employee. And I realized that I had spent so much energy being impressed by other people's success that I had completely failed to recognize my own daughter's." She paused, looking around my chambers, at the law books, the framed diplomas, the judicial certificates that documented the career she had never acknowledged. "I've been taking classes," she said, "community college courses in early childhood education. I want to work with kids, maybe in a daycare or preschool setting. It's something I always thought about doing, back when you were little, but I convinced myself it wasn't practical." The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Ruth Kelloway, who had spent decades telling her daughter to, quote, "be practical," was now pursuing the teaching career she had abandoned for corporate security. "I'm proud of you, Cassandra," she said finally. "I should have said that years ago, but I'm saying it now. I'm proud of the woman you became, and I'm sorry it took a public courtroom humiliation for me to realize what I had lost." I looked at my mother, really looked at her, for the first time in years. The dismissive, critical woman who had shaped my childhood through her constant discouragement was gone, replaced by someone who seemed genuinely humbled by the consequences of her choices. "I'm glad you're pursuing teaching," I said. "You were always good with children when I was young. I remember that." "Do you think," she started, then stopped. "Do you think there might be a way for us to try again? Not to go back to the way things were, but to maybe build something new?" It was the question I had been wrestling with since the day she had walked out of my courtroom. The part of me that remembered being a child desperate for her approval wanted to say yes immediately. But the woman who had built a successful career despite her mother's constant discouragement was more cautious. "I think we could try," I said finally, "but it would have to be different. I can't go back to defending my choices or proving my worth to you." "I understand," she said. "I lost the right to judge your choices a long time ago." We talked for another hour, carefully exploring the possibility of rebuilding a relationship that had been damaged by decades of dismissal and mutual disappointment. It wasn't a magical reconciliation. Too much hurt had been inflicted on both sides for that, but it was a beginning. As she prepared to leave, my mother turned back at the door of my chambers. "Cassandra, that day in the courtroom when I had to call you Your Honor, it was the first time I really understood who you had become. And I was terrified, not just because I was embarrassed, but because I realized I had missed watching my daughter become someone extraordinary." After she left, I sat in my chambers thinking about the journey that had brought us to this point. The girl who had been told she'd never amount to anything had not only achieved professional success, but had done so with enough strength and grace to extend forgiveness to the mother who had doubted her. 2 years later, I would perform the wedding ceremony for a colleague, and my mother would be in the audience, watching her daughter officiate with the quiet pride she should have felt decades earlier. She never got her teaching position. The background checks for working with children revealed the media attention from our case, but she found work as a senior coordinator at a nonprofit organization focused on family counseling. The case of Meridian Financial Services versus Hartwell Construction Group became a staple of judicial ethics courses and family therapy training programs. But for me, it became something simpler. The moment when I learned that true success isn't about proving your worth to people who doubted you, but about becoming someone strong enough to forgive them when they finally realize what they lost. The woman who had called me a failure eventually learned to call me daughter again. And this time, when she said my name, it carried the respect I had spent a lifetime earning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.